was a very nice luncheon and time to meet and to talk with one another. What I'd like to offer are some brief remarks which I hope in some way might be helpful. Maybe one remark or another to different individuals as we prepare to look at the art. Some things I'll say, I know I have before me a group of people very not only acquainted with art in its various forms, but used to looking at art. So some of my remarks may seem very, very general, but I'd like to lead you through some thoughts. It's obvious, those of you who know art or even looked at the video this morning, that we would certainly place William Congdon not only in the category of modern art, which is a very vague term, but generally abstract, as an abstract painter. This would come from the very fact of his training and also the generation into which he was born. Abstract is a very general term too, but we know that in abstract art, the artist in general has simplified the form a bit. It's not offering the form in full, what we would call photographic detail, simplifying form, which also usually results in leaving out some of the detail. And this movement began in reaction to many things, but primarily to reclaim painting as paint. There were artists who felt that painting had become something other than a craft. You couldn't see the paint. You know, when you look at some of the great paintings of the 19th century and even the Renaissance, they're glazed and covered over in such a way as to hide any trace of the paint, because the goal is that the frame becomes a window on the world, and we forget that we're looking at a painting. Modern artists didn't want to forget the craft of painting, and that's part of why they went to abstract. It's less showing things exactly as the eye would see it, but also it allowed them not only to show the craft of their painting, but also to show other things than maybe what the eye itself would see. So we see that, we're going to see that abstract element throughout most of Congdon's painting. Therefore, he's listed among the abstract artists, and you will see in the exhibition that he was ranked among the top. We saw it in the video, Rothko and Pollock and so forth. And he was touted and listed in Life magazine and in New York Times and Time magazine as one of the up-and-coming great American artists of the abstract movement. Now, we know that abstract developed, and increasingly artists left out more and more detail. But as long as a painting, as long as you can recognize in it an object, we call this objective painting. But one can go over the line in abstract, and as you simplify form and leave out detail, one can go to a degree in which one simply has, and I don't want to say simply has, but visually paint, color, shape, and form, and in which there is no longer any recognizable image. So in a sense, all of Western art is either objective or non-objective. If you can see an object, a genuine object in it, as abstract as it may be, that is objective art. So even highly abstract art is objective. But when we reach the case, as we will see in Congdon's later paintings, where we have color, shape, line, and form, then we become non-objective. And it is a fact that Congdon practiced both forms of abstract, objective art, and also non-objective. But in general, he stayed with the image, with some sort of image. And you saw that one little clip in the video where he said, I retain the sun, or I retain the moon. I want something in my painting that was otherwise highly abstract. And so what happened to many artists who were his colleagues is they, in a sense, moved forward in lockstep, moving from abstract to non-objective, and then never returned to the image. But he did. And you'll see that actually after a period of becoming more and more abstract, he begins to come back and to become a little less abstract, and he retains the image. To me, this is a sign of how genuinely free he was, how authentic he was. He did what he had to do internally for his art. And I think it affected his reputation, and that's what I want to address. Because as all of you who know anything about modern art and modern architecture, for all the talent and genius of these artists, the movement did become something of an ideology in which one was expected not to deviate from it. My area, even stronger, is architecture, and I'm sure you know that after modernism came in New York, somebody who wanted to create buildings in a more traditional style there was no one to teach them in the architecture schools. And if a student offered as one of his first projects a traditional building, he'd probably be flunked out in the course immediately. It became an imprisoning ideology, which is why, for example, in New York for almost 40 years, not one building had any top other than the flat top, which held the air conditioning units. And why, when Philip Johnson, with his AT&T building of 1978, had that little decorative element, it created such an uproar. The exact same thing was true in art. And so in Congdon, in this freedom to move into non-objective and then to come back, he broke, if you will, rank with the lockstep ideology. It's often asked, why today, when we see this extraordinary art, is he not today listed along with Rothko and Pollock exactly the same way? And I would say, this is only my own personal opinion, one is he committed the mortal sin of not following the ideology and being free of returning to the image. And this even was referred to in the video that some of his colleagues simply could not understand his return to the figurative image. Well, this is what his art demanded. The second fact was that he did leave the United States, and although Italy has always been such a vibrant center of art, both traditional and modern, he left the New York art scene, and that was also an abandonment, and he paid for that. And then finally, the greatest of all is that he overtly referred to religious imagery, which was simply an absolute no-no, particularly in the middle room we're going to see today with the images of the crucifixion. And you put all of these together, and they may seem like very crass reasons, but probably explains why this artist, who in my opinion, and not mine alone, stands on an absolute level of artistic superiority and interest with Rothko and Pollock, is not as often represented, certainly not in the standard textbooks such as Jansen, or even in the critical literature. But that is being changed. That there is a reversal taking place. And we always have to look at the larger context. But he was free. See, he was free of that. And I think it worried him very, very little, although it must have occasionally occurred to him and occupied his thought, because as an authentic artist, he was not promoting an oeuvre to be part of a movement, but was working from his own interior needs. For him, and that leads me to, and something I refer to, for him art was not only a craft, but it was discovery. It was part of a journey to understand himself, to understand life. And let me open a parenthesis. I wanted to mention this morning and didn't when I talked about how closely related his life is to the art. We're very fortunate to have so much writing by him. Letters to him and from him, journals and notes. We don't always have that much literature on artists as we have from him, but also, we were talking about this over lunch, how articulate he is. Sometimes artists are not particularly gifted at explaining what they're doing. And we talked about his literary training at Yale. He was a literature major. He was really able to articulate where he was going and what he was doing. And so that really helps us to juxtapose, if you will, the life with the art. So for him, art was discovery, and we see that. To close the parenthesis, he was very philosophical in addition to religious. He was asking the questions which we all noted are asked less today. Why are we here? What is this about? Where are we going? What is the meaning of all of this? And that, of course, led then, if these questions are asked on a philosophical level, to the purely spiritual dimension. And as we go through the galleries, he's not showing us, the viewing public, what he was experiencing, but rather working out his own search for God. And so we become participants in that. So we might ask, how do we look at the art of William Congdon? But it's the question, how do we look at any modern art? And you all know that it requires much more work than, for example, looking at the work of the artist I mentioned this morning, Jacques-Louis David. It's more difficult. It's not all laid out for us, and it requires and asks our participation with the artist, which is a wonderful thing. It requires on our part more imagination. He gives us some of the essentials, but we have to bring ourselves. Particularly in Congdon's art is, and the video showed this, the materiality, the fact that he worked with the spatula and rather than with the brush. There is a tactile and physical quality to his art. It invites touch. We may not do so, but it invites it. Now, he is not the first by any means, nor was even Van Gogh. But the point is that his art, the paint, is a very, very important element of it, and it's present to us. I would point out the materiality of his painting, the physicality of his painting, that in some of the early works he incised into it with the awl, he cut into it, that at times he used lead and bits of metal. So there's a great physicality. As we look at it, we need to, because I know I'm very geared to looking at the image and getting the idea or the experience, but also first to look at the paint, and then at the end to look at the paint. So he's an artist who requires me first to come very close and stand and look at the texture and the paint, and then to step back across the room, and there is a different view you're going to have, and then to come back. So that isn't required of all artwork, but it is of his, and we shouldn't neglect that. There's this great physicality to his work. I mentioned the informational material. You are led through this very wonderfully. I think the placards are excellent, and I told you I love them, some do not. I read every bit of it, and it takes longer to go through. But we just have to be sure that after we're done looking at that, we be sure to really look at the art itself. Most of you are receiving today a catalog, and I just want to say of it, I think it's one of the finest catalogs I have seen for an exhibition or an artist, and I have seen many. First of all, in terms of his biography and his artwork, and leading us through the stages of his life, which are more complex than either this video or the galleries we're going to look at today could encompass. The reproductions are superb, but of course with an artist like himself, where the texture is so important, we really are not seeing the art as beautiful as they are till we stand in front of the work of art. There are 4 truly superior critical essays at the back on different aspects of his art, really exceptional work. And then on top of it, they have layered all of this with reflections from Pope Benedict, some of his reflections that he offered in Holy Week some many years ago. I'm at the stage, the way I read it, I'll tell you how I read it. First I read the artwork and left everything else out. And then after a break, and they are demanding, I read over a period of time the 4 critical essays. And right now, and I've received this months ago, now I'm just reading the Pope Benedict's writings in relation to the art. So you'll find it a very, very rich source. It's superbly done. And all of this material certainly helps me in order to understand it. When we stand in front of some of these works, as is always a challenge with modern art, what am I supposed to get out of it? And I think the danger is that as I stand, for example, particularly in the room of the crucifix images, what was he thinking? What was he feeling? Because we know he was going through an exploration. That's really an impossible task. What's important with an artist like Congdon is that I stand in front of it, and knowing that he has so deeply invested himself into it, what does it do to me? What do I get out of it? I think that's much more important, because really that is what he would want to do. An image was used way back by an English teacher, as a matter of fact, about literature, and I share it with my students, and the analogy limps, but I think it's true. When I or you come before a work of art, let's talk today about painting. It can't be, can I get into the mind of the artist? Can I relive? We really can't know. We could be right or wrong, but it's all right to do that, but there's something more rich. Each of us, as approaching art in any form, we're like instant coffee, all right? And when you take the spoonful of instant coffee and you put it in, it really looks miserable, right? It's all dried up, crunchy, and some of it even smells bad until you put the water in. But when you add the water, usually, out comes a really, can be a very good cup of coffee. The artwork is actually that dried, shriveled up stuff that we take out. We're the boiling water. And the work of art doesn't have its completion or really blossom or come to life until we're added to it, and we're the boiling water that brings it to life. And that image helped me. I don't know if it helps you. Perhaps it's a very trite one. But it also empowers us to say that I bring my lived experience this afternoon, and it meets with Congdon's, and I will get out of this whatever I can. And it's no longer important, was this what he thought or whatever. There are artists where that kind of experience really can't happen because the work is a didactic or a programmed work where I either get all the symbols that they put there or I don't. But the wonderful thing with all of Congdon's work, that's exactly what it invites, my experience. And there, my journey joins his, and there is a progression that takes place. My last remarks would just be, if I may, very briefly, about spirituality in Congdon's art. Not all of it, not all of the paintings are specifically about religion at all, but they're all very spiritual. The first thing we could say, and I would just say in general, in my opinion, all art is indeed very spiritual, because in any act of creating, what a human being does is imitate divine work. In the Judeo-Christian view of creation, there was nothing but God was, and out of love, out of nothing, God made something, the universe, the world, us. He made quite wonderful things out of nothing, out of love. Every artist who takes clay, earth stuff clay, to make a sculpture or a pot or whatever, a vase, or takes some simple, that takes a piece of wood and stretches some cloth over it and takes some pigments or whatever. If they're taking nothing and out of it making these extraordinary things, whether they know it or not, whether they believe or not, every creative act is an imitation. It's something divine, and it is an imitation of the divine. It is true that all human work is an imitation of divine work. And there are artists who would object to that, perhaps, but that is a reality, and they don't have to be believers or even conscious. So let me say, obviously, that's the first dimension in Congdon's art, or anyone's art, that we could say of the spiritual. Second, you will see immediately how beautiful these works of art are. Beautiful in their materiality and their craft. We all know the degree to which our current pontiff, Pope Benedict, has written about the fact that the artist in presenting beauty is opening a window to the divine. Because God is the ultimate beauty, the source of beauty and beauty itself. And so every work of art which is beautiful in some way is an intuition of the divine, without exception, in literature, in music, in painting, sculpture, or whatever. So there's that dimension. But there's also his conscious search for God and for meaning, for which, as I mentioned, I think he paid a price in terms of critical art world. And it becomes very, very conscious. There is a progression as we move from the three rooms.